Hi, I'm Julie Hansen, and I'm so happy to be here with you today and share how you can elevate your virtual executive presence. Now, virtual executive presence is relatively new on the scene and it's been very underexplored, but it can have a dramatic impact on your career if that career involves influencing anyone, such as if you're in sales, for example, or a leader. So, what we're going to look at today is how virtual executive presence really differs from traditional executive presence, which you may be very familiar with. Some of the challenges we face when trying to convey executive presence through the camera, and then some of my top tips on how to quickly express virtual executive presence in your virtual meetings, recordings, conversations. If we haven't met, I am the author of Look Me in the Eye Using Video to Build Relationships with Customers, Partners, and Teams, which is really a how to guide on how to connect through the camera. And many of these tips are from that book, as well as from my course, Virtual Presence for Sales Pros, which I'll share a little more about that as we get going here. So, what I want to do is just start by having you think about what words come to mind when you think of the word executive presence. What qualities does that convey? Well, they might be some of these. Many people say, well, someone who's trustworthy, right? Someone who's has leadership qualities. And I encourage you to go even deeper than that. What does that mean? Well, they're confident, they have a vision, they're empathetic, they're authentic, they're good listeners. There's a whole bunch of qualities that we associate with someone who has executive presence. And ultimately, executive presence is about the ability to influence with credibility, confidence, empathy, as a good listener. And that's something many people have mastered in their career or certainly developed some skills around. So, what is virtual executive presence, you may ask? Well, it's really the ability to influence with all those same qualities in a virtual environment. You may think, oh, big deal. I'm going from here to here. How is that different? Well, we're going to see how that's different and how that impacts you. And I want to ask you another question. I want you to think about, are you the same credible, confident person on camera as you are in person? You're probably saying, well, yes, Julie, I think so. I don't turn into another person just because I step in front of a camera. And that's probably very accurate. However, let me ask that a different way. Are you perceived as the same credible, confident, trustworthy, interesting person in front of the camera as you are in person? That's a different question, isn't it? And that may leave you thinking, I don't know. And the truth is, most people don't know. And the fact is that the perception can be very different from what we portray in person. And so we can't be in the dark about that because those are some vital qualities that have repercussions in how people interact with us and how much influence we are able to exert. So what happens is the qualities that make up executive presence, like credibility, confidence, being a good listener, being authentic, being empathetic, are some of the most difficult qualities to convey on camera. And that's why even Harvard Business Review said that it's harder to build a relationship and to build trust virtually. And this is part of the reason that these qualities are very hard to express. And the reason is a couple things, actually. If you think about an iceberg, if you were sailing along in the ocean and you saw just the tip of that iceberg, you might think, wow, that's beautiful. Let's get a little closer. But of course, you're only seeing, 10 to 20% of it. If you had the whole picture, the 80% that's below the surface, you might think, uh, let's stay a little farther away. I don't want to get too close because you have more information. And this is very much what happens when we're on camera. 80% of our body language is gone. right? And so everything happens with this 20%, 15 to 20% right here. And that often doesn't express the same thing as your whole, the whole package when you're in person. And so we have to compensate for that. And we have to know what that 20% is saying. And most people don't have an answer to that. The other thing that makes conveying these qualities of executive presence difficult on camera is some of the ways that the camera distorts reality. It flattens things out. And you may have heard the expression that the camera adds 10 pounds. I'm afraid there's some truth to that. And it is because of that flattening effect. But more importantly, the camera does things like takes away a big chunk of your energy. And that's why so many virtual calls are just so boring and tedious because people aren't bringing nearly enough energy to the call. And they're in a seated position, which is typically low energy as well. In addition, the camera distorts things by minimizing certain behaviors and magnifying others. And if you don't know the difference, you can end up sending the wrong message to people. And so there's a lot of miscommunication that takes place because of these signals. And lastly, speaking on camera is simply an unnatural act. And I know you've probably been on camera or virtual for at least 3 years or more, some of you more. But if you think about it, that's just a drop in the bucket compared to a lifetime of honing all these in-person skills you have. We're really just toddlers in this virtual world. And speaking on camera is not natural. Nobody's born with these skills. We often think actors are just naturally good at it. They're not. I worked as a professional actor and I had to learn when I went from stage to screen how to do basically the same thing, but in front of a camera. And there's a lot of nuances to that. So it's difficult. And if we bring the same skills in front of the camera that we do in person, they're going to be misread, they're going to be misinterpreted, and we're not going to be as effective. So when I saw everyone after the pandemic sort of jumping on camera and not having this skill set that I learned as an actor, that's when I wrote my book to really break down how you do all these things, because I think we oversimplify how we should behave on camera by saying, well, just do what you do, just be yourself. And certainly we don't want you to turn into someone else, but there are some very significant differences and still allow us to be authentic and ourselves on camera. And so out of that came the book and the course to help people really walk through and learn those skills so you can be present and be your best self on video. So the fact is that it's a new medium and it requires new skills. And we need to adapt some of those if we're going to communicate as effectively as we do in person. Let's look at a couple of the qualities that express executive presence, express virtual executive presence, and what happens on camera when we try to express those the same way we do in person. So, for instance, one of the ways that we determine whether someone is confident or credible is through direct eye contact, right? We associate direct eye contact with having confidence. There's studies that show that leaders tend to make more direct eye contact. So that's a learned behavior, a learned trigger, right? Direct eye contact also conveys credibility. We tend to believe people who are looking us in the eye as opposed to averting their gaze, which you may be familiar with if you've ever asked your kids if they've eaten the last cookie, right? So it's something that we have developed over our lifetime, that these things mean confidence. These mean the person is telling the truth. Because perception is reality on camera. It may be that you're telling the truth. It may be that you're very confident, but if you're always looking down or kind of the shifty eye syndrome, we're not going to perceive that. And our perception is absolutely wrong, but perception is reality on camera. And this is typically what we see in virtual meetings from leaders, from salespeople. They're looking down, they're looking at their screen, aren't they? And that makes sense. It's logical because that's where the other person's image is. And yet, to the other person, our brain, which has these signals wired in our head that looking at us directly means you're credible, you're confident, you're interested, you're listening to me, doesn't read it the same way. The other thing about confidence on camera is that one of the things about confident people is they don't tend to panic or rush, right? And yet, what happens on camera is we don't have the same cues from our audience that we do when we're in person. So, for instance, if I threw out a question to you and you were an audience in front of me, I could see either raised hands, like there on the left, or I could see people thinking about responding. However, if I do that to a virtual audience, like right now, or even if I had your images up, I would not see those same cues. I would have a lot of blank faces looking down at their screen. And that can be very frightening to most people, whether you're in sales or a leader. It doesn't, it's not what happens in person. It's not what we're used to. So, what we do oftentimes is we rush in and we fill that space. We quickly answer that question. We don't stop long enough after a sentence to allow people to jump in because we get afraid of those silences. And so that is a new skill that we absolutely need to build up. In terms of active listening and executive presence, active listening is one of the biggest things you can do to build trust with someone. A bunch of leaders were asked, how can you best build trust with us as a salesperson? And they answered, listen, right? However, there are two distinct types of listeners in virtual meetings. There's the screen starer, right, which we talked about a little bit, and then there's the darter, which is, maybe looking at the camera, looking at the screen, looking at the camera, looking at their tools, looking at their presentation. And of course, we associate that with nothing but negative behavior. On top of that, there's this issue with the transmission of sound that we can only hear one person pretty much at a time when we're in a virtual meeting. So all those little verbal signals, those cues that would indicate you're listening, like, mm, those just get lost. So there the other person is thinking, you're not looking at me. You don't sound like you're interested. Are you listening? Right? Prove it. The other qualities that are often missed or misrepresented on video are empathy and interest in others. Whether you're a leader or whether you're a salesperson, people want to feel that you care, right? And you're interested in them. And so it's very important to express that. However, as I mentioned, we have a lot of blank faces staring back at us on virtual meetings, whether you're the presenter or the audience. And it's so common, I call this resting business face. And it really is just that on screen face that most people bring to a virtual meeting. And certainly it's deadly when you see it on a presenter. It's very boring. It's very hard to engage with them. It certainly doesn't give off an ounce of emotion, right? And it's scary as a presenter when you see that in your audience. So we have to learn to manage those emotions and understand what's happening here, so we don't just react to that fear. And because we've only got this 20% space to work with, it's very important that our face get involved in our communication more so than it does in person. Because if your face has nothing to say, why are you on camera? I think it's a good question to ask yourself. Your face needs to convey a lot of the things that we did with our entire body and our energy that we have when we're in person. It needs to take the place of some of that. So, traditional executive presence, the things that you do to build traditional executive presence, will fail in a virtual world if you don't adapt for the camera, if you don't understand what your 20% is saying, how to make sure it's aligned with your words and your intention. And so, what I want to do is look through a couple of tips that you can apply to quickly convey more virtual executive presence. So, these are things that I'm going to go through very quickly. There's a lot underneath as far as how you do it, but I want you to understand the behavior. And then if you want more information about how to do that behavior in a virtual environment, which is often the tricky part because most of them are counterintuitive, we have some resources for you. So, you ready? Okay. So, the first one is to manage your 20%. Again, everything that is in this space should be very intentional. Should support what you're saying. It should make you look like you're an authentic person, which means you have to frame yourself correctly. It means you have to have the camera at eye level because that quickly communicates status. And make sure that your background isn't stealing the show, right? The background is just that, it's background. It's not the main character. That's you. There's a couple chapters in my book about that because there's lots of pieces to that. But again, manage your virtual stage, that 20%. And of course, try to activate those authentic expressions. We absolutely don't want to be miming for the camera, but we do have to get to a place where we're in our most expressive mode, whatever that is for you. And oftentimes, for business people, that takes some work to get to that point because we've been taught to sort of repress those emotions and too much activity in our face. And so we have to sometimes reconnect those muscles and the triggers. The other thing we want to do is, of course, look at the camera. Now, that's a whole, there's 2 chapters in my book just devoted to how to do that, and 3 videos in the virtual presence course on how to make eye contact, when to make eye contact, what type of eye contact, when can you look away. It's, it's something that sounds very simple, but frankly, if it were that simple, you'd see a lot better eye contact being made in virtual meetings right now, and we don't. So there's a lot to it, but it is a skill, and actors learn how to do this because, again, it's not natural to talk to a camera, especially if no one's on the other side. If you're recording video, that's as close to being an actor as you may get. So a very nuanced skill, but there are steps to it. There are strategies, so you don't have to just try it on your own because, again, that often leads to frustration and failure. Avoid fast, vague movements. You've probably seen people that move very quickly and it makes you look very nervous and distracted on camera. So we want to make sure our movements are very clean and specific, very purposeful. Again, we don't want to paste in some phony gestures because we want things to come from an authentic place, a need to communicate, a need to express. But then we want to make sure that we work with those gestures and understand where our frame is and what's too fast and what is too close to the screen and distracting or getting in our audience's personal space. And we need to learn to embrace that purposeful pause. Again, confident people don't panic, they don't rush. There is a reason that we pause, and often the only time the only person who's panicking during that pause is you, the person speaking. Because what's happening is most people are going through a process in their head where they are thinking about either what you said or processing an answer to your question. And that takes some time. So just because you can't see those visual cues that you would see if you were in person, because people are much more passive on video, and so their face is not very engaged or active, doesn't mean it's not happening. I timed out this process of someone to have to go through when they're thinking about answering a question, and it could take 15 to 17 seconds. Now, I'm not saying you have to always wait that long, but if you tend to interrupt every time and jump in and answer that question yourself, you will teach your audience that they don't have to interact with you and they won't feel particularly engaged and you won't get the benefit of knowing how they feel. So, virtual executive presence, this ability to influence with credibility, confidence, interest and active listening and empathy is absolutely vital for sales leaders, for any leaders, for salespeople today. And it's really a differentiator because you'll see so many of these behaviors that are ineffective in others as you start to look around and are more aware of it. And so just know that it really stands out, and all these things add up to, gosh, this person hears me, they see me, they understand me. And that's the ultimate goal, right? To make others feel seen, heard, and understood. And we can do that by adjusting our behavior for the camera. So those are just a few of my tips. If you're interested in more information about this subject or a course on it, go to my website at juliehansen.live. I have lots of videos on this and blog posts, or you can get the book or enroll in the class and get coaching and assessments. But again, it's important not to be in the dark about how you do come across to others, how this 20% reads, and take charge of that, because that is your calling card. That is your ability to influence in your role. So I hope you enjoyed our little chat here today and took away some tips you can apply. And if you'd like to reach out and connect, I'd love to connect with you and hear any questions you might have.